Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. Today's episode is an interview with Kyle Gunn. Kyle and I attended the same conservative Christian college together, and I thought his unique life experience as a black man in a conservative Christian setting would provide for some good discussion on racism and propaganda. We cover a lot of ground in this episode, but there are two particular concepts I want you to listen out for. First, Kyle helps us to see that complexity and nuance are vital for undercutting propaganda. We can often tell when something is propaganda by its lopsided nature. If something is portrayed as all good or all bad, propaganda is likely at play. Our history education should take a broad look at people and events in order for us to see history from all sides and to hear all voices. Hearing a diversity of voices is essentially the geolocation of veracity. It's the triangulation of truth. I'm certainly not going to trust some historical dude's autobiography to paint a whole picture, nor am I going to trust a nation's story about their founders when that same nation deifies them in statues and artwork. I'm going to need more than a one-sided look at something to understand it in depth. So nuance and diversity are important in undermining propaganda. Second, Kyle astutely points out that propaganda is double-pronged. While we focus mostly on how propaganda positively inculcates beliefs into a target community, Kyle points out that propaganda can also influence the opposing community, the community against which the propaganda is levied, particularly if that community is oppressed or is a minority community. Now, this is a concept that we saw in our last season as well, as those who are abused are disparaged and propagandized by their abuser, and they may actually come to internalize some of those falsehoods as truths. The same is true about racism. Racial propaganda may have largely been wielded as a tool to get whites to think poorly of blacks, but it can also have the effect of getting blacks to think poorly about themselves or about others in their community. So as you listen to this episode, keep your ears open for these concepts. Now, let's get to the interview with Kyle. I wanted to talk to somebody who had similar experiences because I know that going to our college, there weren't all that many black students there. And so I know that you kind of have similar experiences to me, but from a black perspective, which I wanted to get to. So before we get into that, would you mind introducing yourself and just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's an honor to be on this podcast. So I've done a couple of them, and I like to pretend that I'm podcast famous, which I'm not. But just going back and listening to some of your episodes, the first thing I had was imposter syndrome. I was like, why is he asking me to be on this podcast? And how you deliberate and your knowledge and just how much you research before you just spew something. And I made a conscious effort to think to try to listen to how many times you said, I think, or I feel, and it's very rarely. It's basically, here's some data, here's something I'm processing and I'm going to share it instead of I think and this, that, and the other. Not necessarily bad, but I was really appreciative of the stuff that you present. But who I am, I'm, like I said, I'm Kyle Gunn. And I'm one of 7 kids. And the Lord saved me at an early age. I was 5 when the Lord captured my heart. And I'm one of the few, I think I was just blessed that the Lord has given me a strong sense of my salvation. I've never doubted. And I know doubt is a real thing, but for me, I've been blessed with just always knowing when the Lord saved me. So 5, and then I was homeschooled all the way up to 9th grade. Then I went to a public high school, and like I said, I'm 37 now. So high school back then was a whole lot different. We didn't have cell phones, but I was a popular kid in high school. And everyone knew I was a Christian. I started, the See You at the Pole. I had Bible studies, and it's just a lot different. It was a great experience. I tend to be outgoing, so being homeschooled, even though I had a lot of brothers and sisters, was kind of I need something more. So I say I had the best. I have all of it. So first grade, I actually went to a Christian school. Second grade to ninth grade, homeschool. In a public high school. And then I went to a Christian university, although they would say universities aren't Christian, they're Christ-centered. So I went to a Christ-centered university, Cedarville University. That's how I got to know you. We were the same college. And then after college, I did a few odd jobs, couldn't really find my way. Went to school for college for Bible, couldn't really find my way. And, recently, I started this job here. I do dispatch now for a trucking company. Absolutely love it. And I'm married, been married for 7 years, have two beautiful kids. They're 4 and 2. And on this podcast, I know that we're gonna just say honest things. So my wife is white, so I have mixed kids, and they're absolutely gorgeous. Everyone knows that. So it's like mixed kids have the best of both worlds. I feel like a daughter and a son. I think part of who I am also, you're informed by what you go through, both the good and the bad. So we suffered greatly, through several miscarriages to have the kids that we have. So that element of suffering and pain allows me to, I think, understand a lot better and differently, and to interact with people who have gone through the same thing, because it's incredibly lonely. I think you mentioned earlier, I had I do like a blog where I post during Black History Month. And I think that's what kind of opened up this discussion. So I really enjoy history, specifically history that intersects Black American experience with the larger American experience. So that's a little bit me in a nutshell. If you want to know something, ask me. So I don't know if you are.
Yeah, no, that's exactly why I wanted to talk to you, because you have a very informed knowledge about Black history, but at the same time, you've gone through very conservative circles, and so I think that's kind of a rare thing, because a lot of times those voices are shut down, or people are skeptical of them. So I wanted to be able to get your perspective from somebody in those circles, and I talked to a wide variety of people. So so anyway, let's kind of start at the beginning of kind of what brought you to my mind. We went to the same college together. It was a very conservative Christian college, very white college, and it was so white. And I vividly remember that, and I don't know if you remember this, you probably do more vividly than I do, but there was a worship leader who wore a rebel flag t-shirt in the front of chapel one day. Do you remember that?
I actually don't remember that. I don't remember that, because I think that when events like that happen, honestly, they happen so much that you kind of don't let them affect you. I remember it slightly, but not vividly. I remember seeing it, and I knew what the flag meant. I was just like, that's weird. But yeah.
Yeah, for me, and this is sad in retrospect, but the reason I remember it is I was like, because I think somebody emailed a complaint to leadership, and they just profusely apologized, and I was like, that's so ridiculous. People making a big deal out of somebody wearing a flag, because in my mind, I came from farm country Pennsylvania, and in my Christian school, you had these redneck guys who'd have trucks and listen to country music and have rebel flags on their trucks, and you don't think anything of it. And so I was just thinking, why are people making such a big deal about this stupid flag? It's just a flag that people who listen to country music like. And so I was absolutely oblivious to how that came across to at least some, if not a lot of people in the Black community there. So maybe you could start off our discussion on propaganda by talking about a little bit about some of the racial propaganda, whether that's images, phrases, actions that are infused into our culture,
Yeah.
especially the conservative Christian culture that we might not realize.
Right. So, I was thinking about this, like, so when you were talking about propaganda, and you laid out beautifully like what it is, who's it works on, and like I said, I was reeling because I'm an educated, intelligent, smart Black man, and you're like, well, it works on you. That's the primary demographic. And I was like, no, I know propaganda. That's not true. And then the more I sat back and thought about it, the more I was just like, you're right. That's how it works. And propaganda, I think, is not so much now about beating you over the head with a club, dropping leaflets down, during World War II. Like propaganda, they honestly thought, hey, why don't we drop down condoms so that they think that we're more endowed than they are, and then we'll cower. Like that was an idea that they had. That's not so much propaganda anymore. Propaganda is subtle, and it's supposed to be, because you need to buy into it, and you need to realize it, and you need to enjoy it and love it. The first thing I thought of was like one of the best propaganda machines I think ever is Apple. Apple has so inundated our culture that we have a demographic of people that will firmly believe that there's no better technology than Apple. And we have created a culture that hates green bubbles just because that propaganda has, and that's our enemy. It's like, oh, get an iPhone. You know what I mean? And I'm fully aware, like I have adopted that, and I know when I'm being propagandized by Apple. Like I have the AirPods, I have the watch, and I have the phone, and so that was just a little aside there about propaganda. But some of the imagery that we see, and some people don't really understand it, I would say see one that's more recent. So that was the whole Uncle Ben, Aunt Jemima, um, not scandal, but that whole saga of like why people were angry and why some weren't. And people are like, well, we're honoring them. Mostly white people would say that. Me personally, I had chosen long ago not to buy those products from Aunt Jemima. First of all, because I don't think it's that good, you know. But secondly, it was the imagery. They were like, well, she got a job and she was able to provide and support. And it's like, yeah, but the whole mammy archetype figure, like took that from a minstrel show that he watched. Like he saw like a character in blackface playing an Aunt Jemima figure and took that and put it on his box and labeled it because that's where Black people belong, in the kitchen. So those are that's a huge imagery. And I also kind of with the whole Land O'Lakes butter, and people are like, well, you're erasing history. It's like, no, we're not erasing history. History is still there. We still have powerful devices that can search anything. Like, and I would kind of say some of more phrasing that's propagandized is because propaganda always has truth in it, right? And it has to in order for it to be believed and perpetuated. So one of them is that calling muscular women manly, like our former first lady Michelle Obama was often called a man because she had sculpted biceps and she was in shape and she was fit. The Williams sister often are called manly, and it's like you can have the same type, white woman the same way, but they are elegant and demure and graceful. But calling a a muscular woman manly, that's something that has been propagated because here's the truth in it. If you go to a bodybuilding show, everyone is trying to get darker because the muscles look better under the lights. It just pops a little bit better. That's just because of coloring. It's nothing, not racism or anything. It's just that's what it is. So when you have kids, you watch them develop. A Black kid will often look more muscular just because of that's the makeup of the body, which in turn leads into actual like racist policies. So did you know a kid, Black children often seem 7 or 8 years older than they actually are. So let's say you have an 11-year-old right? And let's say he's cutting up or acting up or doing whatever. A police officer rolls up, he will see that kid as 18 as an adult simply because the makeup of his body, that's just the way his body is. And so muscles develop and they look different, they look enhanced or whatever, what have you. And so he will often be seen older and thus treated as such, even though it's an 11-year-old kid or a 10-year-old kid, just a boy. Same thing happened, story after story. Tamir Rice, had a toy gun, rolled up, shot him, you know. Um, I think being considered loud. These are phrasings, or asking us, "Oh, you can probably dance really good, or you can probably sing." Just kind of those. Those are all propagated that this is what we can do alone. Um, let's see. Races like early on that we know is blackface. Everyone can spot that. Even watch old Bugs Bunny cartoons, and you're just like, um, did I see what I just? Yes, you did. So those are, some of the things that I've noticed, and now it's a little bit more subtle. So here's the subtleness of it. Um, we that is pervasive. We had a state senator in Ohio who is a doctor in an emergency room said maybe COVID-19 affects the Black community because they don't wash their hands as much. This is a state senator who said this out loud. Not it was he said that like to somebody else, and then you're just like, how can this be? And there's still a level of doctors who actually think, you know, um, black skin is tougher or thicker, and therefore they don't feel pain as much. During the opioid crisis, if you remember that, the large numbers of them were not part of the Black community. Why? Because doctors actually prescribed pain meds less because they had the belief that was propagated that Black people get addicted more. So the opioid crisis wasn't as effective, and maybe that's could be construed as a good thing, but it was because they weren't being prescribed pain meds. So you
Yeah.
had a large population of groups of people in pain because doctors believed that they were addicted more, and they would use them to sell.
Well, not to mention
Right.
the response to the crack epidemic. Oh, we need to
Right.
throw those people in jail, and then you got the
Yes.
opioid epidemic. Oh, these poor
It's a mental
people. We need
crisis.
to help them.
Yeah. It's just, and later on we'll probably get into generalization versus individualizing certain things. Um, uh, I think I kind of lost my train of thought, but I think that's what I was kind of going with the settle. Oh, also, so the COVID-19. Now, further on, monkeypox is a huge thing, and there's subtlety in there that it originated in Africa. Monkeys are often back in, largely linked, to Black people. You know what I mean? They were called monkeys and apes and gorillas and savages and things like that. So even the term monkeypox to me is just like I cringe at that terminology, because I know because of propaganda, it's going to conjure up images in certain people about who gets monkeypox. And which can lead to divide of I don't want them living next to me. I don't want Marta. You know what I mean? Property values, and that's simply just for the term monkeypox. And we had a prominent person continually over and over refer to COVID-19 as a Chinese flu, the Chinese virus, and there was a lot of Asian hate and Asian racism because of that. Just the terminology of what we use that people don't understand is like we've been propagandized to view it that way. So, and even if the person's not necessarily using that way, we're just calling it monkeypox. Some of those images that will pop up that you have to guard against, are not healthy.
Yeah, and what's really ironic to me is that the conservative crowd who would say that, he didn't mean it that way. The language
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, I'm not going to call him they them. they're like, language
Right.
matters a whole lot.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yes.
it matters a whole lot when when it's an issue that you recognize, but
Hmm.
when it's an issue that you don't want to have to deal with, then language doesn't
Hmm.
matter at all.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so that's a pretty good list of starters of some of the propaganda that's out there.
Hmm.
Um, for me, if we would have had this conversation 10 years ago, I
Hmm.
I would have been probably largely blind to it. And when I look back at what kind of shifted it for me, it was around the time of Eric Garner and the time of Ferguson, Missouri,
Hmm.
when all those things started to happen. Um,
Hmm.
it was a decade after I graduated from college, and I remember arguing with my wife when I was just telling her, like, I mean, it's sad, it's tragic, but
Hmm.
I mean, like, I understand why the cop did what they did. Like, I mean,
Hmm.
I'm not a big guy. If somebody who's 6 foot or taller is walking towards me and has any muscle mass whatsoever,
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
I'm gonna be scared. Like, how do I know if
Hmm.
he's gonna keep coming? How do I know if he has a knife? How do I know
Hmm.
if he's a gun? He reaches for his
Hmm.
waistband. How do I know what he's gonna do? Like, I
Right.
understand from the cop's perspective. And
Hmm.
but she kept pushing back, and she was like, well, yeah, okay, you might be able to understand from the cop's perspective, but nobody's trying to understand from the black
Hmm.
person's perspective. Like,
Hmm.
do you think he has a reason to be scared of the police, to be
Hmm.
scared that if he submits, he's going to be harmed, or he's
Hmm.
yeah, what we know about the criminal justice system and the conviction rate,
Hmm.
if you get booked, you're pretty much going to have to cop a plea deal in
Hmm.
order to get out of there, because you're pretty much guilty, or you're going to sit in jail
Hmm.
forever, or you're going to go through all these expenses. So
Hmm.
it was it was when I finally started to look at the other side, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna start listening to black people. I'm gonna start talking to them. I'm going
Hmm.
to start reading people. Um,
Hmm.
and when I started reading black authors, that 100% just absolutely transformed my perspective, because you can
Hmm.
go all the way back to um, like Du Bois,
Hmm.
and he talks about some of the same issues that we have today. And you look at
Hmm.
police violence; it's not a new thing.
Hmm.
I think it's a new thing because I'm
Hmm.
just hearing about it now, but it's not
Right.
a new
Yeah.
thing. So anyway,
Hmm.
listening to the black perspective is what ultimately helped me to start to transform. So I'd like
Hmm.
for you to talk about how important diverse stories and voices are
Hmm.
to cut through the historically white perspective and white
Right.
propaganda. Like, what are some
Right.
voices
Yeah.
that maybe you recommend,
Hmm.
and how does doing that cut through propaganda?
Hmm. Um, yeah, it's vitally important, I think, um, because as we talk about, as you've been talking through this season of propaganda, propaganda likes neat, tidy boxes. It likes to be able to put something in and categorize it. It needs the buy-in of a large group of people. It needs silence. It needs to be pretty. It needs not to have any pushback. That's what propaganda is. And so, removal of diverse stories and voices, you get your perfect echo chamber. You get the feedback loop. You get the gratification that you want and you desire. Now, that our natural tendency to want to categorize things in and of itself is not a bad thing. I think that's fundamentally how we were created. We're both believers, so a lot of my worldview is going to be shaped by my belief, right? By Christianity. So one of the things is, being a created being, God put order into chaos. Then Adam was charged to name all the animals. So he had to categorize them. He had to put them in boxes, or he had to tie them. So that that's not bad. That's not a bad thing, because that's fundamentally gets back to how we were created beings. And we know that our brains tend to want to, like, our brains take shortcuts. When we see things, they will just put them where they're supposed to go and kind of fill that in. Um, and so when we have know diverse stories, it's easy and simple and it's categorized for us. Okay, this is what I know. Um, and even going to all mostly white college and things of that nature, it was very rare, you know, to have diverse voices. There's a couple years ago, something went around Facebook asking who was your first black teacher, and it was like, if you didn't grow up in that space, you're like, I think one time a teacher's aide, what came, and it's very hard to realize, like, oh, wow, I didn't have any type of other input. And we know that diverse stories, and like, I have a natural tendency, I love history, right? So, and we know that history is written by the victor. So, of course, our American history is going to have a level of veneer on it. It's going to have that. It's going to have a gloss. It's going to have rough edges, kind of shown down and things like that. There's nothing, well, yeah, there is something wrong with that, but that's how history is made. So diverse stories actually open that up. It opens, like you said, when you start reading Black authors, actually open up your mind to, wow, I never would have known this if I didn't choose to read this. Also, I think the diverse stories cuts off or doesn't allow us to categorize things as other, as them, or they always, or the reason is because A, B, and C, or speaking into something that you're an outsider just looking in. Doesn't mean that your voice is not heard. For instance, like, I can speak and say, I think drug abuse is not healthy. It's not good for you. I've never done drugs. I'm not a drug addict, but I can observe and say something about it. But sometimes saying something about things that you don't truly understand or have placed yourself into, and we see that this happened with our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Not trying to use that perfect phrasing, but Jesus, what did he do? He left the right hand of the Father to do what? He actually put on flesh, dwelt among us. He didn't have to do that, but he chose to. And he was tempted just like us, experienced hunger just like us. He cried just like us. It wasn't as if he was just speaking into a situation saying, y'all need Jesus, y'all need me, but I'm not really going to do anything about, like, I'm not going to insert myself into that situation. Does that mean we need to all go live in the hood? No, not at all. But at the same time, opening yourself up, and I think that's what diverse stories do. You know how how amazing it is to have TV shows like Blackish, just simply because it highlights, a section of society that it goes against the narrative. So propaganda is also about feeding a narrative, correct? So it goes against that. That's why Black Panther did so well, because it finally showed a nation that wasn't considered third world all the time. And it was fictitious. But why is Wakanda so highlighted? Why did that movie do so well? Because it reversed the narrative that, Black people are inferior and that they're subjugated and they should be, and they never have things right or they can't be successful. So I think that's what diverse stories do. And I think it's good for us to have those, to hear those words, even if you to disagree with it, hearing other stories, voices allows you, I think, to be a better person and a better Christian. Like, Jesus wasn't always, in Galilee. I need to go to Samaria. And he heard another perspective. The story that Jesus engaging with a woman anyway, then a Samaritan woman, then a woman who had been divorced and remarried and was living with, like, all three of those things are taboo in that culture. And he engaged with her, and she engaged back. And then, she had been propagandized about, where do we worship? And he spoke into that. He spoke through it. He spoke against it. And I think that we as Christ followers, it behooves us to do that, instead of just like, well, these are our theologians, you know. So I hope that answered some of the questions that you have.
Yeah, and it's actually a good lead into my next one because, and I'm scared to ask this question, and I mean,
No, ask it.
you've listened, and you know the outline of my season so far.
Mm-hmm,
I love the church, but I
mm-hmm,
also it hurts me to think about
mm-hmm,
the state of the church a lot of times. So I want to know,
mm-hmm,
has your experience with the white Christian community, the white Christian church, been
mm-hmm,
any different than your experience with the broader white community, or are they
mm-hmm,
fairly indistinguishable? Like, does the church
mm-hmm,
cut through the lies of racism better, worse, or about the same? And then why do you think it is that way?
yeah, but that's a doozy of a question. So I want to go back and speak to my experience here. So even within the church, I think we don't do a good job of when we preach the gospel, for instance, like sin is often termed as black. So even as a young kid, I often thought that God hated me, the person, because I was black. And it was, largely because of how it was presented and inscribed. Now, do I think some of the pastors were purposely saying, you black people are actual sin embodiment? No, but we have to be cautious and careful of how we even say certain things. You know what I mean? So the idea that me being a stain or a sin, I felt it was me. So within the Christian community, you can go and Google images like racist images. And oftentimes the KKK in full regalia are meeting in churches. You know, signs that say that Jesus saves, but not the nigger. Like we do, you're not welcome here. And I remember as a kid, and I asked my mother about this one day. We were traveling, and I was young, so the details are hazy, but I do remember this. We went and we sat down in church, and a little while later, usher came and whispered in my dad's ear, and my mom looked down the aisle and said, "Hey, we gotta go. We gotta go." So we got up and we left, and I was like, "Mom, why do we have to leave?" And we were just visiting a church. Later on, she told me that they said that the scripture forbids being unequally yoked, and then they stopped. So they consider unequally as worshiping together with black people, and you and I know that is the most egregious disrespect to that verse ever, because they just stopped at unequally yoked. Had nothing. They didn't read it in context. They didn't even read the rest of the verse. And they applied that to people who did not look like them. That happened to me. And so I would say, how has the church dealt with it? Not very well, you know? And I love the church. And I say this all the time. This is one of the things I say, that the gospel is more powerful than what man tries to do to hinder it. So there is no reason why a black person would ever be a Christian, just on the surface, because what has been perpetrated in the name of God to, quote, my people, right? Why on earth would I ever be a Christian or serve or worship this God that you claim gave you the right to own a person with a soul? But in order to get rid of that, you need something neat and tidy, and said that black people don't have souls. You know what I mean? So why on earth would I be a Christian? Well, it's because the gospel is more power. It breaks down barriers. Um, and so you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say. So you say that the gospel breaks down barriers,
Hmm.
but it doesn't seem like it does. So,
Right.
like,
Yeah.
what's up with that?
I would say, I mean, it does break down barriers in a um, spiritual sense, but a lot of times we'll stop there. For instance, we just need to preach the gospel. We just need to preach the gospel. Yeah, but that dude's hungry. Like Jesus didn't he just didn't preach the gospel. He also fed the 5,000 with women and kids, right? He just didn't just do one or the other. It was both. So the gospel reached my heart because I saw the God behind the love. Nevertheless, Christ is preached. I saw behind that. And there were good people that did share the gospel. Um, and then second of all, I think so we'll kind of move a little bit forward. So historically we can say, man, that was really a bad time. Now, let's just not talk about it. Don't talk about it too much, you know, because you'll be like one of those. You'll be woke, and we're tired of hearing about it. And then everything and anything becomes considered woke if you talk about injustice, And I'm just like, how and why is seeking justice something that is mandated? Walk humbly, do good and seek justice. How has that become something that's woke, like, or bad? And partly it can be because if we're only looking at the temporal, that doesn't add and not look at the eternal, then the idea of just justice here and now does fix some problems. It dresses it up, but it doesn't fix the eternal problem, ultimate justice, right? But if you just only seek ultimate justice and you forget the injustice that's happening on a temporal level here on earth, then you're just like, you stay where you are, you continue to suffer this injustice, but one day it will all be made right. It's like, no, I think we're called to reverse the effects of the fall. I think we want to work on those injustices. So that's from the Christian perspective. And I keep saying, like, all this, I don't hate the church. I'm not into sheep bashing. I love the church. I'm part of her. I'm part of the bride of Christ. The larger white community, I would say, has handled it a lot better. And I'm racking my brain when this question was posed, like, why? Shouldn't it be the opposite? But somehow I don't think it is from my experience that, you know, those who don't call themselves believers have oftentimes been better at cutting through the propaganda and the lies and racism and even acknowledging it or doing some way to fix it, for lack of better words. And I don't know why that is. And I think sometimes it's okay to not have all the answers. Like, I don't know why, but I wish it weren't so. And Derek, time and time again, like, the church has gotten things really wrong, really wrong. But there are things that we get right. But for some reason, I don't know why it, we have, it hasn't been as well as what I would like to have it be as a Christ follower.
Yeah, that's acceptable to not know. And I think it's good to acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I want to move on to I think the part that I was looking forward to the most, because every year you post something every day during Black History Month, a different story. I don't know. Do you do different ones every year, or do you?
Some get recycled, but I like to try to choose different ones every year, or sometimes I'll focus on a theme. But yeah, it just highlights Black history during the month of February.
Yeah, and I think uncovering history is really important because it's those diverse voices, but then it's also, for me, books like The Color of Law was extremely helpful for me, because it's, okay, he's just dispassionately looking at, here's an event, here's an event, here's an event, here's an event. And it's like, well, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to say, wow, that's a lot of events like this. What's the common denominator? And you can start piecing things together yourself, just from dispassionate facts. So I love your Black History Month. Before I ask you a question about it, does it ever strike you? I'm sure it has, but does it ever strike you that it's a little bit ironic that Black History Month is the shortest month of the year that they picked? Do you think that's a conspiracy? They picked a month with 28 days?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. I'll tell you why. It's because Lincoln and Frederick Douglass' birthdays happened in the second week of February. So long before there was actually a Black History Month, blacks would actually, honor and celebrate that week because, as you know, Abraham Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation of the slaves, right? Frederick Douglass, huge in the abolition movement. So Frederick Douglass, I think his birthday, he celebrated on the 14th. I believe Lincoln's birthday was on the 12th. So it makes sense because it was actually called Negro Week when it was first instituted and adopted. And that was a term that they used back then for Black people, right? So it was just a week at first, and then it just expanded to the whole month. So I don't know. It's not a conspiracy. It's not like, okay, you just get 28 days. Maybe we'll give you 29 every now and then. We'll call it leap year. You know what I mean? No, so it's not a conspiracy. It was just, two of the greatest figures in history. Um, their birthdays coincide in February.
Okay,
So.
that's really good to know because when you start going down, different rabbit holes about government
Right.
and racism and
Mm-hmm.
stuff, it's easy to be really cynical about
Oh
motives and
yeah,
everything.
yeah, for sure.
Okay, so here's my first question in relation to that. Heritage and tradition, we would say, are important things, and that's part of the reason that we celebrate Black History Month. That
Mm-hmm.
there's heritage and tradition that's wrapped up in there
Mm-hmm.
that we celebrate. So when you think about heritage and tradition, they are good things that we try to keep and that we pass down. But when you take a look at propaganda, it's sort of the same thing. It's information that we want to propagate and
Mm-hmm.
hand down.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look back through history, through U.S. history in particular, do you think that the
Mm-hmm.
United States is the type of nation that when we talk about heritage and when we talk about
Mm-hmm.
making America great again, like it used to be, like
Mm-hmm.
our heritage was, how do you
Mm-hmm.
distinguish between these two ideas of what is good heritage and tradition to pass down
Mm-hmm.
and what is mythology and propaganda?
Yeah. Um, I think that's one of the good things about history and trying to uncover um, what really happened is the key. And history should not only be looking for the stories that make us feel good. I think history tells us where we've been, where we are, and where we are going. That's what I always say about history. It's alive, and it's good for us. So I think, what do we hand down? What is tradition? What is heritage? What should we be proud of? What should we, leave behind or let go? Goes back to having stories that are divorced from different voices and different perspectives. So when I go back and I look at history, I like to say, like, we were so close to being a nation without slavery. It was in the Constitution, but that phrase was taken out in order to get the Southern states to align and overthrow, and get rid of the British, right? So I mean, we were so close. Um, and another thing I hear from people is like, well, Africans were rounding up their own people and selling them too. That's part of the history too. And I always like to say, do you buy everything that's being sold? What kind of nation could we have said or been if we had never bought them? Even if they're on sale, did we have to buy them? I was like, no, why don't we do something different? You know? But that's not the case, right? So going back in history, I think what we need to do is acknowledge the fullness of history, good, bad, and indifferent. So we can say, hey, this person did amazing stuff. Thomas Jefferson didn't want slaves, but he owned slaves and had kids with them, and and raped black women. So what does that do? You need to look at it full in the face and say, okay, what can we learn from it and what do we not want to pass down? So I know people whose um, relative ancestors fought in the Civil War as a Confederate. So what do you do with that history? So you need to look at it fully and say, okay, he was fighting for an ideal that was wrong. What can I take from that? Whether that be fighting for something that you believe that let's make it on the right side of history this time. But you can't deny that you had a grandfather, a great grandfather that fought in the Civil War and wanted to own people. Does that mean, okay, I need to take everything he believed in and then instill and be like, yo, great grandfather, he prayed before going to battle, and it was like, okay, but what was he praying about? States' rights. Well, what were one of the states' rights? He said, well, they wanted to own a people, they want to own people. Like, but I think for me, when I look at history, I always call it our history. Like Black history is our history. Just founding fathers are my founding fathers too. Even though, some, were racist, some were believers, some were agnostic, but that's part of history. You cannot just pull a strand out and say, okay, we're not going to deal with that or look at it. Because it distorts the whole image. It just distorts everything. So I think it's important to keep those things, and people talk about, erasing statues is erasing history. I'm like, well, how many times did you actually read the plaque? Did you actually read it? I don't think it's because you have no idea about it. Just like one of the things, it's really disheartening. So for a long time in New York, there was a statue of a man, and I forget his name, and it's going to bother me, but he's considered the father of gynecology. Figured out it's a medical issue. But he was in the rural South operating on Black and enslaved women without anesthesia because they were, quote, not worth it. And one woman went under the knife, I think, 13 times, no anesthesia, operating a system. It was, I can't remember what the disease or the cause was, but it had to do with, the private parts. I'm just trying to be discreet, but imagine getting operated with no anesthesia. And then once he figured it out, he moved his practice up New York, opened it up, and offered anesthesia to his white clients. Father of gynecology. Now, does gynecology help us? Is it good? Yes. And we also we honor this man. Like, but the history we lost. Look at history full on and grapple with it. That's what we need to do, is grapple with it, because we're in danger of doing the exact same thing that was perpetrated in the past, but just in a different way. Just like saying, Black people are more violent or savage or more sexual deviants and things of that nature. We'll just do it more subtly, but we're still doing the same thing of operating on enslaved people without anesthesia.
Yeah.
I know there's other parts of your question. Remind me if I have not answered them.
Yeah, sure. When you said savage, have you seen the movie Zootopia?
I have, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that was such a good, like, our kids like it, but then as you're watching it, you're like, oh, that is so good.
Yes,
it's
a metaphor.
Good.
Yeah, really good. Yeah.
So I think you said a really good word there, in that I think you can tell something's propaganda oftentimes if it's lopsided, because heritage and tradition should be inclusive of the good and the bad. It reminds me of so have you read To Kill a Mockingbird, or you know about it?
I have, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we named our first son Atticus, and we had chosen that name, and then after we chose the name, Harper Lee, I think it is, she came out with her second book, or announced that her second book was coming out, and then everybody started naming their kids Atticus. But my wife read the second book, and everybody hated that book, except for her. She liked it because in the book, Atticus Finch, who is this man of integrity in the first book, and he's just this staunch protagonist. In the second book, you're like, oh, he, some of his motives weren't good. He has some racist beliefs, even though
Hmm.
he helped his black client. He's just
Hmm.
he becomes very complex, and he's not like a
Right.
you're like, he's not really bad, but he's not
Hmm.
really all good. So, we're used to these Marvel superhero movies
Yeah.
where all good
Hmm.
or all bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's propaganda.
yeah,
That's propaganda. It hates complexity. I mean, you said that yourself. It hates complexity and loves simplicity because you can wrap it up in a neat little bow. Go on. Sorry.
no, yeah,
Hmm.
spot on. So, I think what you said there about, um, heritage and tradition versus propaganda is, accepting all of our history.
Hmm.
I think that's good, and I have to remind myself of the opposite a lot of times. That it,
Hmm.
as I look through American history, I'm like, man, there's no good, nothing
Hmm.
whatsoever.
Right.
And so I
Right.
have to remind myself that there is good, and to be able to kind of balance that out and recognize truth,
Hmm.
the good truth and the
Hmm.
bad truth.
Hmm. Yeah. Correct. Correct.
Um, all right. So next question. Uh, when I think about our history, and when I
Hmm.
think about racism and the bad things that have happened to Black people, as I reflect on how I used to think, oh yeah, that was slavery up to civil rights,
Hmm.
and basically once you get civil rights, I mean you're good to go. Like now
Right.
you're one of us, and
Hmm.
there are a lot of things that kind of shattered that realization for me. A number of different events,
Hmm.
but one of the ones that was the most profound was when I was at a, a rally or whatever it was, for, I think it was the One Race movement. One of the
Hmm.
speakers um, said that he was talking to his mom, and he's like, "Mom, why
Hmm.
didn't you like?" Or his grandma, "Why didn't you keep fighting for rights?" And she was just like,
Hmm.
"We were just so tired." And I was like,
Hmm.
"What? Oh, he so they didn't really accomplish
Hmm.
everything then, right? Like they
Hmm.
just kind of it was a realization for me where
Hmm.
I thought that rights were obtained and
Hmm.
everything was good to go, but the Black community
Hmm. Hmm.
recognized that that's not the truth. So maybe you could talk
Right.
about maybe some of the propaganda surrounding what actually happened with the civil rights movement, why the
Hmm.
Black community, by and large, doesn't think that
Hmm.
was maybe as good as a lot of white people think it was.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Um, so, speaking of the civil rights, one thing, you say, at your sign off, because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it, when you tell people peace. Um, I recently, well, I've been having an internal struggle with pacifism, because you have two people, you have MLK and you have Malcolm X, and they're often pitted against each other. And to me, I hold this idea that I honestly think for change to happen, you need both. I think the peace-led movement, it does show the monster, because when you're not violent, it shows them as a monster, right? Just like when Emmett Till's casket was open, it shows like, wow. Or the images you see of black people being attacked by dogs, and they're doing a peaceful protest, right? It shows that. But if there's no underlying course of like, if you push me too far, like, we're going to have to do something, So I do think we need both. But so civil rights just on paper legally said, oh, it you are now a citizen. That's all it did. Which it said it took so long to be recognized as a citizen of this nation, even though every major U.S. conflict in our history, Black people have fought in. Every major conflict, every single one, even when we were slaves, fought in, for this country, for its ideals. And you're like, why? Because they believed something that this nation could be, even though they didn't experience it. How would, feel like you fought for this country and then you come home and you don't get the same rights that you were fighting for? There's a battle in World War II where black and white soldiers fought against each other in England because they were allowed in the pubs. And their white soldiers was like, you can't allow them here. And they're like, this is not your country. They can enter in here. And a battle was actually fought against white soldiers and black soldiers because they weren't in their place. So fast forward a little bit, civil rights happens, and right to vote, yes, all this stuff is good, and it's just like it was just on paper. So legislation doesn't change the hearts of men. So even though you gain these inalienable rights that should have been granted from the beginning, doesn't necessarily mean circumstances on the ground have changed. So, all the time, then what happened? Jim Crow happened. So if you look at every step that has been advanced or gained by the black community, I'm speaking about the black community, there's always a reaction to it to push it back. So you have, the freedom, okay, so let's say you had slavery, and then slaves started escaping. And then what did they passed the Fugitive Slave Act to get them back. Slavery ends, and then you have indentured servitude, sharecropping. You get civil rights back, and then what do you have? You have Jim Crow. You say 3 words, Black Lives Matter, and then you have Blue Lives Matter. So everything there's always going to be a reaction to push it back. And so we have Jim Crow, which is a little bit more subtle than the sharecropping, which is a little bit more subtle than the Fugitive Slave Act, which is a little bit more subtle than outright slavery. And then even with the passage of these laws, you have subtlety. You know what I hate the most is reading that slavery is abolished, except in the payment of crime, or except for crime that you are duly convicted. And then we can talk about incarceration rates, right?
Yeah, you had convict leasing and war on drugs, all kinds of things.
Right. Yes. All that, and it's like all of it plays into that role. And then I tie it back to the fall of man, where we're each clamoring for dignity, so we subjugate others to get that value. And so with that being said about that phrase, and so you have mass incarceration rates, and largely and all that is due to poverty. Like you said, like poverty plays a large role. And why do we have poverty? Because of injustices. And propaganda. It likes nice little neat packages, right? And no outside voices. So for me, I think, in my opinion, there is a nice little neat little time in history where you can almost pinpoint generational property, ghettos and hoods, and why it's still perpetuated today. It is after World War II, the GI Bill was largely refused to Black veterans. And after that time, we see wealth being accumulated, generational wealth, where a veteran can come home, get a mortgage, and pay off their house. They have an asset now, right? That can be handed down to their kids, who can build upon that, right? And you keep building and building and building. But let's say you come home as a Black veteran. You don't get that GI Bill. You can't buy a house. You get redlined. So where do you buy the cheapest house that you find, or you rent? And what do you not get to do? You do not get to build generational wealth, assets, something that you can hand down. And you can see almost from that point how things just continue to get worse and worse, and why ghettos and hoods and and gangs and violence and all that stuff that is propagated, that's all we do, came to be. And there's an element of truth to that. So it's interesting. If you ever have time, go back and look at the GI Bill and what happened after that. And even like the color of law talks about, do they talk about redlining in there and how recent that happens? Personal anecdote, personal story. When my wife went to look at houses, I always had her go in first to ask about the house, to get the pamphlet. She asked me why, and I told her, I don't want them to say they have a buyer when they see me. And that's just how I walk, because largely I walk in white circles and I tend to be in white spaces and things like that. So I am considered more of like, well, I term myself like the safe black person. People can ask me any question, right? And I don't shy away from just, it's just ask. If it's on your mind, ask. Even if you say, well, it's going to sound racist, just ask the question, and I'll tell you. But so that to me, that's a personal story. Um, and I think I kind of forgot the question here. Um, but I hope that I'm not just going on too many tangents or rabbit holes
No, it's
there.
good. Yeah. So even though I definitely identify as a pacifist and think that is the best way to convey
Sure.
the kingdom of God. At the same time,
hmm
I do have a lot of respect for people like Malcolm X, and I don't know if you're familiar with Robert F. Williams, but he is
Not as much.
he is like my favorite at the moment.
Okay.
Even though he was pro violence, he didn't ever really use violence, but he definitely used the threat of it. Like, hey, this is what I'm capable of. But you should read up on him.
Okay.
He's got a book called Negroes with Guns, which is good, but there's actually another book which is a lot more detailed because he doesn't. He's a really humble guy. He doesn't toot his own horn at all. But the biography of him like really goes into his exploits a whole lot more and plays him up. But it's called Radio Free Dixie, and he actually it's called that because he when the FBI chased him for doing nothing, of course, he fled to Cuba where he was he was given free passage, and he started a radio station there, and started Radio Free Dixie back into the United States, trying to teach the black community about
right.
Not rebellion, but hey, look, we can be free. So he's an awesome guy. You should check him out.
Okay, and I definitely will. Speaking of Cuba, here's another side. Just like the history of baseball has a lot of Negro leagues that stayed in Cuba and would play ball down there and be like, "This is great! Like, I'm not going back." And we're actually like white Americans were angry that they would stay over there. It's like, you need to come back to America. It's like, well, why? Like look at the history of baseball in regards to South America and Cuba, where they experienced a lot more freedom. They're like, yeah, I think I'll stay here. I think I'm good. I'll check out. What is it's you said Robert Fellows?
Robert F. Williams. I'll send you a link
Okay.
for
Yeah,
the
definitely
book.
do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you've mentioned him a couple times in previous podcasts.
Yeah,
Episodes.
he's pretty amazing. But it also, part of why I read that was because he was involved in depropagandizing, because when you hear, you're like, wait a second, Cuba is communist. What do you mean? What do you mean people are going to Cuba to be free? And that just that messes with the American mindset that no, we're free here.
Right. Going back to propaganda, one thing I wanted to bring up too was the other side of propaganda. So let's say you have images, that are overtly racist, right? And they show like minstrelsy, and they show blackface, and the big lips, and the big nose, and being a savage, and like all that stuff when we think of racist imagery, right? To the people that it's not directed toward, that's the enemy. Yeah, they're like that. But the people that it's representing, after a while, if you see this year after year, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, 120 years, you begin to believe it, that this is who you are, right? You start ingesting those ideas that you perhaps maybe you are inferior. Maybe this is true about me. Yeah, there is a lot of crime. So the opposite side, the converse side of propaganda is those are insulated from it. They have their own breeding ground, their own echo chambers, and they're safe. The ones who are on the outside are not safe for two reasons. One, propaganda created an enemy. Two, that enemy begins to ingest that propaganda themselves and begins to believe it. And they start to, self-fulfill prophecy. That is very true. I was talking to a man, I work in a logistic field, so we have a lot of truck drivers. A man, he's in his mid 70s, alive, alert, looks great, funny, black don't crack. Like you would never know he was in his 70s. And he's telling me he remembers the signs that say colored only as a kid. He remembers sitting in the back of the bus. He remember like he says, I can viscerally feel what it's like, even as a young kid, that you're inferior, that your water fountain looks a hell of a lot different than the white water fountain, and you do not drink from there. He remembers being the first class to desegregate a school in Texas, you know, and he said, I just remember being in high school and they're saying, oh, they're going to rape our women. And then we desegregate that school and the white girls can't keep their hands off us, and and I'm not saying this like, I'm just using the term, the terms. And he's just like, and then we get accused of rape. And he's like, we're trying to bat these women, like girls off us because like we knew what it meant if we were caught, and he's like, and then, lies are spread. If you reject her, you raped me. If you go with her, you can be killed. And he says, I remember in Texas, they called it a hanging tree. And he said, one of my friends, that one week, he did something with a girl and he was on that tree. This is a person who's alive, and I'm just like, so this is what propaganda does. It can be subtle, but the other side of it is not so subtle. It's dangerous. And my own grandparents, I think I shared this story in the Black History Month. My grandfather and the famous Woolsworth sit-ins happened all across. There was more than one Woolsworth. The famous one, I think, is in Chicago, but there was one in Norfolk, Virginia. My grandfather was the first one to go behind the counter and sit down at a stool that said whites only. So that's a history that I have, and I'm just like, that's history you can touch. It's not so long ago. And it's just like the mindset when you begin to ingest it. Ibrahim X. Kendi talks a lot about this in his book about anyone can ingest and begin to believe racist material, even the one that is perpetrated against, because of how long it's been ingested that maybe you are inferior. I just want to kind of highlight that as well.
No, I think that's important. There's the famous study. I don't know if it was from the 60s or 50s or whenever, but where they had children that were taught that they were inferior, primed
right.
to think that way.
Mm-hmm.
Kids with blue eyes, whatever. Or
yeah, I remember that study. Yeah.
But I just finished a book called Chokehold, which is written by a Black man who is, or at least was, a prosecutor. And it was really fascinating because, he wasn't just talking about theory. He's saying, hey, look, I was a prosecutor. I dressed this way. Here's what I thought. Like, I wanted to nail those punks. I laughed when they came into the courtroom dressed a particular way because I knew I could nail them and get them the maximum. And so he talks about how he internalized propaganda to, and then how that impacted the way that he treated, he treated Black people, or he looked at them as inferior. And he also gave some interesting statistics that he talked about how Black police officers have a higher rate of violence towards Black people. He part of what he talks about is just the internalization
Right.
of
Right.
that.
Yeah.
And so exactly what you were saying. It was
Mm-hmm.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, I think last question here.
Mm-hmm.
So in regard to Black history, there are a lot of people who are familiar with things like the Tuskegee experiments.
Mm-hmm.
Most people know about that as
Mm-hmm.
okay, that's a conspiracy that really was true.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, of course, that has come to light. But
Mm-hmm.
when I read through your Black History Month stories, I'm like, man, that's a scratch on the surface. There's so much
Mm-hmm.
that people don't know about. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so a couple months ago when you did your Black History Month, you had a story
Mm-hmm.
on uh, what is it, Vertus Hardiman,
Yeah.
and where he and his siblings were experimented on,
Mm-hmm.
similar to the Tuskegee experiments.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that most of my friends probably view racist examples in history as kind of
Mm-hmm.
like exceptions. Oh, well, that
Mm-hmm.
happened, way back then, or that happened sporadically at this place or that place.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really a rule, it's the exception.
Mm-hmm.
But
Right.
at the same time, so they view offenses against Black people as the exception, but
Mm-hmm.
they simultaneously view Black crime as the rule
Mm-hmm.
and not the exception.
Mm-hmm.
Black people are violent,
Mm-hmm.
and they probably wouldn't say that, but
Right.
they
Mm-hmm.
think it. So maybe you can kind of unpack um, how a history of violence against Black
Mm-hmm.
people isn't an exception, and this double
Mm-hmm.
standard that my community has, where we individualize our flaws while generalizing the flaws of the other group.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Oh, great question. So the first one, there's a book I read, and it talked all about like medical atrocities within the Black community that happened. Um, Medical Holocaust. I'll find it, and I'll let you know later what that book was. But it talks a lot about um, in the medical field what that happens and how it's still kind of pervasive. I mentioned it before about the opioid crisis. About medical field is still treating Black people as inferior or not listening to their pain meds. And just the statistics about how many Black women actually die in pregnancy in a first world country than their white counterpart is astounding. I'm not going to give it because I don't know what that statistic is, but when you look it up, it is pretty astounding. Um, and so I would, so the big ones that we know of would be the exceptions, right? The ones that kind of happen pervasively throughout, like hearing stories here and there about a woman not getting COVID-19 treatment, finding out she's Black. And a lot of times when we see and we realize these things, it's kind of like, yeah, that happens to us. We know. There is a strong distrust of the medical field in the Black community um, due to atrocities that happen to us. Strong distrust. Um, I did before this happened. I even recognized propaganda that was happening in the Black community about for the COVID-19 vaccine, even though regardless of what your stance is on the vaccine, but commercial after commercial would talk about this vaccine. I'm going to take it because I know it was worked on by Black doctors and the Black community. We have a higher rate of you know diabetes, which will actually make COVID-19 even worse, right? Those things are true, but the idea with that propaganda was to subvert the propaganda that was already in place. So, okay, we actually really need you to take this vaccine, um, even though historically we did medical scientific stuff or experiments on you. But it was done by Black doctors. They helped work on the vaccine, so y'all need to take it, okay? But that propaganda was just to reverse what was done for hundreds of years. Um, so generalization versus individualizing something. That is something that I've looked into or I've thought about and pondered. Why is this the case? And I think it's a myriad of different things. But I think one of the biggest things is the Black community is often seen as a monolith, right? I mean, we even had someone saying, our current president saying, "Oh, the Latin community is more diverse than the Black community," right? We're often seen as a monolith, and that is not without its truth. There's always a little bit of truth. Why are we seen as monolithic? So therefore, we can generalize everything to a whole people group. Is because the Black, uh, experience, Black people had to become more cohesive in order to survive. you know so a lot of people don't realize that after the right to vote passed, there was classes on how to answer questions so you can actually vote. You know what I mean? So there's cohesion in there. How to, stand together, the bus boycott, there's cohesion in there. So being a monolithic culture, we tend to be that way because we know that that's what we did to survive. Even phrasing within the Black community is monolithic, meaning if a national tragedy happens, an atrocity happens, a lot of us say, "Oh, I hope he's not Black." Why? Because we know, and we'll even say because it'll set us 10 years back. Why is that the case? Because there is that monolithic idea, that culture that is pervasive, both by our doing to survive, right? But also propaganda likes to put things in boxes. So they always do this, or it others people, right? So twofold is why individual happens. And then largely within white America, the rugged individual as the American, right? We are individual, freedom and this, that, and the other. You can't tell us what to do. That ideology plays a role in why when you fail or you do something wrong, it's individual. Like, oh, they did that. That's not all of us. We're not all rapists. Um, but if it happens to someone that's Black, they're all like this. They're rapists because of those two factors at play, right? Rugged individualism, monolithic culture, one to survive, one the burgeoning, of a nation, right? And that whole ideology and that mindset of what America is, right? So to me, I think that's why this happens. That's why it's generalized. And it should not be that way. Um, but sadly it is. And I don't really know how um, to do, to counteract that. For instance, like also when you have success stories, like largely, when a Black person is successful, you're like, see, look, he's successful. And it's like the exception, not the rule. We had a Black president. Oh, that's awesome. Or we can still name first Blacks. Simone Manuel became the first Black woman to receive a swimming medal in the Olympics, you know, and that happened, what, 4 years ago in the Summer Olympics? Like, we're still naming firsts. And that should be the success, should be not the exception. That should be the rule.
Yeah, speaking of swimming medals, it's one of those things that Black people are known to not be great swimmers,
Mm-hmm.
or to like the pool, and
Right. I mean, people say because
it's a
they had
stereotype.
denser bones, like.
No. Well, I reading that book
Mm-hmm.
on Robert Williams, it
Mm-hmm.
clicked for me. I was like, I'm an
Mm-hmm.
idiot. But so
Mm-hmm.
one of the big confrontations that he had was he went out and he protested that Blacks weren't allowed to use the pool, the
Mm-hmm.
community pool. And so one of the stories, one of the things that kind of got them fired up was that um, there were some Black kids who went to the local quarry because that's where they
Mm-hmm.
would swim, and they ended up drowning. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was like, oh my goodness, like, so it's probably it's not this like, well, they have an aversion to water or they have denser
Mm-hmm.
bones or whatever else. It's
Mm-hmm.
no, they were excluded from the place where people go to learn to swim safely, and parents
Mm-hmm.
were like, no, you're not going to go to the quarry.
Right.
And so
Mm-hmm.
they're insulated from being able to learn how to
Mm-hmm.
swim. And that was
Correct. Yeah.
just a revelation for me
Mm-hmm.
of like this this racism, how it's
Mm-hmm.
impacted people to develop a particular action stereotypically. And
Right. Yeah.
it's just so tragic that Black people were swimming in quarries and dying, and so they were prevented from swimming at all.
Yeah. When you put them start putting pieces together, you're just like, wow, I never saw it this way. And still to this day, because the confluence of cities, they don't have access to the pools in the gated community. So still, there's a lot of Black people who cannot swim. And then you have, it is easier and cheaper. Let's say you have a school that's struggling. It's cheaper to put a track or basketball and offer that as sport than a swimming pool because of the money. So then you'll have natural excelling at track sports, And I mean, I love the Olympics. I love watching track. I'm just like, yeah, look at that. Look at all that black girl magic, black boy magic. You know what I mean? I just love seeing it. And it's just like, why is it? Now you can do some scientific stuff and look at slow twitch and fast twitch fibers and muscles and things like that. But it is largely based on access and injustice and poverty.
Yeah. I think that's all I have for you that I could think of. Is there anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah. Two things. One, I would encourage any of the listeners who have not seen the documentary 13th, watch it. And there's other things that you can watch too, but watch that one. Secondly, if you love podcasts, listen to Wrongful Convictions. Have you heard of that one? It's with Jason Flom, and they are part of exonerating, death row innocent people. It's the Innocent Project, right? So he heads up the Innocent Project, and it will open your eyes to there is a different legal system for poor people. There's a different legal system for poor Black people and poor white people, right? And you even mentioned in your racism segment about you would think the people that had the most in common, poor white people and poor Black people, they could like work together, but oftentimes they did not, right? They would say, I'd rather be poor and white, than, to be a Black person, right? So it's called Wrongful Convictions. And it's just story after story after story. And you're just like, people when they were teenagers getting locked up for decades, And beside that, the last thing, there was just a Supreme Court case that got passed that if you are no other evidence can be for a death row inmate, no other external evidence can be admitted in your case. Yes. In your case that wasn't presented before, because usually if you're like, well, new evidence has come to light. I think it's a segment of cases. I think it's whether if you were on death row or if you had certain amount of appeal, but still they have made that you cannot do that anymore. And that is going to affect a large amount of minorities who are innocent in jail.
Yeah, I'll have to research that and look that up and see what the rationale is, because I know that I know that the justice system likes to look right, and so is this a response to
right?
We don't want to plug up our system anymore with appeals because we've already got too many things going on, or is it because we want to look like we got it right the first time and we don't want to keep overturning these?
Right. Yeah, but Wrongful Conviction, you'll learn a lot in that podcast.
Okay.
So yeah, that's all I had.
All right. Well, thank you so much for giving me an hour and a half of your time.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, thanks for staying up this late too.
Yeah, no problem. That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.